After 8 years of waiting, it feels good to have the Umbra Witch back in Bayonetta 3. And she brings with her new enemies, a powerful ability called Demon Slave, and even more epic set pieces that push the Nintendo Switch to its limits. Bayonetta 3 put a stupid grin on my face from the very beginning, making me realize how much I missed this kind of wild and carefree style of gameplay. While I kept that grin throughout most of my playthrough, there were some moments that also left me scratching my head. So, is Bayonetta 3 worth the wait, and could it be the best game in the trilogy?
Does anyone mind if I cut in? Wouldn't want to step on anyone's toes.
This time, Bayonetta isn't battling the forces of heaven or hell. Now, she's taking on man-made bioweapons called Homunculi that are wiping out universes one by one. With the help of an Umbra Witch in training, Viola, she travels the multiverse in search of tools called Chaos Gears to access the Homunculi homeworld and destroy them for good. To succeed, she'll make great use of her Umbra Witch powers, weapons, and tremendous new ability that turns her infernal demons into puppets. Combining these features results in a wonderfully chaotic combat system, which is what the Bayonetta series is best known for. The gameplay feels both new and familiar, retaining the wonderfully smooth controls of the first two games while introducing new ideas of its own. Bayonetta feels wicked fast and agile, landing numerous hits in quick succession, aided by her bewitched firearms and demonic powers. Dodging enemies with good timing triggers witch time, or bullet time basically, and it's one of my favorite abilities, because nothing is more satisfying than pulling off a perfect dodge, only to be rewarded with a few seconds of slower time to get the jump on your enemies. While the basic fundamentals of combat are here, there are still notable differences, such as how the Umbran climax from 2, which made Bayonetta more powerful, has been omitted, which I'm okay with as it wasn't that interesting to simply power up. Furthermore, the torture attacks have been changed to activate by pressing A and X when enemies are stunned by demon slaves, which I prefer for being snappier and no longer requiring any button mashing. Now let's get to the literal biggest addition to Bayonetta 3's combat, the Demon Slave ability. By holding ZL, Bayonetta can take control of gigantic demons to attack enemies and solve puzzles. Naturally, there are limitations to Demon Slave, as the demons vanish whenever Bayonetta gets hit by an enemy or when her magic meter runs out, which regenerates during combat. And they can't be summoned in small places like hallways either, but those are relatively uncommon. A lot of these demon types return from previous games, like Gamora, Madama Butterfly, and Phantasma Renee, with a couple of new ones like War Train Go On. Their completely different designs make for unique fighting styles. Gamora, for example, bites and breathes fire, and Phantasma Renee crawls on walls and pins enemies down with webs. War Train Go On is unique in that you lay down a path for it to follow, ramming through everything in said path. I wrote off this demon pretty quick because I didn't like how it brought combat to a screeching halt whenever I used it. I much prefer the rest of the demon ensemble that play a more active role in battle. Their appearances are not limited to just Demon Slave, however, as moves like Wink Slave cause them to deal brutal finishers when the player presses ZL after a combo is finished. Additionally, Assault Slave lets the demon jump in to deal a powerful counterattack against anything that dares hit Bayonetta. I sometimes preferred quick moves like these instead of Demon Slave, as it allowed me to stick to playing as Bayonetta while getting the satisfaction of watching my enemies crumble under the hands of demonic behemoths. As cool as this feature is, it can also be a bit awkward, as the camera has to keep both a stationary Bayonetta and moving demon in frame, which isn't ideal for tracking these colossi, resulting in fumbled maneuvers and turns. Thankfully, some puzzles pan the camera back to make controlling demons easier, although I did find myself better adapting to the camera and controls as I played. Part of that came from realizing I should only use Demon Slave in short bursts to save on magic and prevent them from getting killed by giant enemies, thus putting them out of commission for a bit. And if a demon gets attacked too much, they break into a rampage, slaughtering everything in sight, including Bayonetta. It really adds incentive to use this move sparingly. Bayonetta even hops aboard these creatures during certain segments, like sliding through a crumbling city. These cinematic sections are short but sweet, making you feel all-powerful as you take direct control of these monsters. The camera controls are better too, following the demons at all times as they do their best to balance on tiny boats in the river. I don't get how the physics work in this scenario, and I don't care, because it's rad as hell. As much as I enjoyed Demon Slave, I wouldn't mind seeing less of it in a theoretical Bayonetta 4. I feel as if this new feature, though fun and creative, sort of took over as the key gameplay element of Bayonetta 3. On one hand, it's technically an optional feature at most times, excluding some specific sequences, but the game still encourages you to use it often to fight enemies that would otherwise be quite tough to bring down. In that regard, the excessive use of Demon Slave makes the game feel less like Bayonetta and more like something else, namely Platinum's cancelled game Scalebound, where the protagonist would take control of giant dragons. Seems that Bayonetta 3 heavily borrowed from this idea, and while it could use refinement in the camera and controls, it still works really well. I just wish Platinum put some reins on this feature so the focus would lie more so on Bayonetta herself during gameplay rather than Bayonetta as a puppet master. Outside of Demon Slave, Bayonetta has a slew of new weapons and abilities that make combat as diverse as ever, and they do much more than simply change Bayonetta's attacks, as her form now changes completely while sprinting or occasionally during combat, letting her adopt the looks and traversal abilities of the demons tied to each weapon. These powers range from gliding to triple jumping, wall climbing, or turning into a locomotive. I know the hype train for this game is off the rails, but this is ridiculous. I never desired to change my weapons in previous Bayonetta games, mainly because the default ones worked well enough, but I love the variety and effect each one has in 3, while also having their own strengths well suited for different situations. The G-Pillar deals massive damage to giant enemies, and I never felt hindered by its slower attack speed, but my favorite might be the Ignis Arane Yo-Yo, due to its great reach. Bayonetta's entire arsenal looks cool as hell and is absolutely fun to play with. Each weapon and demon has its own skill tree too, with new abilities like combos being unlockable using orbs you collect in combat. In the last 2 games, these would have been purchased in Rodin's shop, and it's nice to see these moves relegated to a skill tree, so I don't have to worry about choosing between health items and weapon upgrades. Consequently though, it's made Rodin's shop less useful. Sure, he still sells valuable items like lollipops that regenerate health, but now he deals mostly in cosmetics, like new dye for Bayonetta's outfits and items that can be placed in the map screen room. I've mostly visited the shop to replenish lollipops, and that's about it. Bayonetta's usual currency, halos, are not as common in 3, so Rodin now takes new currency dropped by defeating the new enemies, Homunculi. Made by humans, these bioweapons are out to destroy entire worlds, and they come in all shapes and sizes. There are the regular foot soldiers that do their absolute best, and then there are the bigger baddies that are tougher to kill. Some of them are so big they barely fit on screen. Those giant enemies are easier put down with Demon Slave, some of them practically requiring it. Despite these weapons being man-made, their designs are otherworldly, and just when you think you've seen all of them, they keep surprising with something more wild every chapter. These unearthly enemies know how to make battles interesting. My only complaint is that their origins could have been explored better, but I'll get into that further when I talk about the story. Speaking of that, there's a new character that enters the fold in Bayonetta 3, Viola, an Umbra Witch in training, equipped with a katana and a demon named Cheshire. Players take control of her in a few chapters, and gameplay-wise, she's quite different from Bayonetta, though she is just as fast and agile. She has a charge attack unleashed by holding and releasing X, a block which triggers Witch Time if used right before an attack lands, and magic darts that deal small amounts of projectile damage. She even has a grappling hook that lets her swing across gaps like PlayStation 1 Spider-Man. Holding ZL unleashes Cheshire, but he can't be controlled. Rather, he automatically attacks enemies while Viola takes them on with her bare fists, since he's tied to her blade. Viola doesn't play better or worse than Bayonetta, she's simply different, and that's the best compliment I can give her. Her combat style is just as fun, albeit limited thanks to her lack of interchangeable weapons and demons. This makes it a nice and brief change of pace from the usual Bayonetta gameplay. But what's really a change of pace are the side chapters starring Bayonetta's friend Jeanne, in her own mission that ties into the story later. These are 2D stealth levels with a retro layout and HUD, where Jeanne has to sneak from point A to point B using quiet attacks and air vents to get by. They were a neat novelty at first, but they don't offer any challenge nor significant story moments until the very last chapter. It might have worked better as one whole level designed in the standard Bayonetta gameplay format, instead of 4 micro levels spread throughout, as they interrupted the story's flow. Those missions certainly added to the runtime though, as Bayonetta 3 took me around 14 hours to beat, and that was after completing some side content. It would have been a lot shorter had I stuck to the main path, but the levels are bigger and contain more secrets than ever before. The optional battles return, with hidden verses that bring back angels as foes. Then there are the verses that warp you to a hidden location with tasks like surviving within the time limit or defeating all enemies with modifiers, like only dealing damage during witch time. They reward you with witch hearts or moon pearls to increase health or magic, which is nice, but I later ignored these side battles as I collected more than enough hearts and pearls from treasure chests and Rodin's shop. That doesn't mean there's no incentive to beat these hidden verses, especially if you're aiming to 100% each chapter and get those pure platinum points. Hidden verses are far from the extent of Bayonetta 3's side content, as there's a lot here to keep completionists busy. Bewitchments, for example, are achievement-style tasks in each chapter, like performing a full barehanded combo on an enemy or not hitting any obstacles during a running sequence. And like achievements, there's no real reward beyond the satisfaction of inching towards that 100% completion rating. There are also these clock puzzles that adjust and freeze time while turning Bayonetta into a child. By moving the clock in the right place, paths of rubble can form for a young Bayonetta to get a collectible, like a journal entry. These echoes of memory are not like the ones from previous games that provided interesting lore, but instead tell stories of memories from other universes, like a young Umbra Witch who completed her training and another that participated in a bowling competition. But because these tales didn't relate to the main story, I didn't find them too enthralling. Finally, we have the Umbran Tears of Blood, which are found in most chapters in groups of 3, carried by a cat, crow, and frog. These fast animals are difficult to catch, but collecting them unlocks remnant chapters, which are smaller, alternate versions of the chapters the tears were found in with a new challenge, like collecting 5 treasure chest pieces within a limited time, while also fighting a giant enemy who's holding one of them. These are fun challenges to come back to after completing the game, if you don't get them during the first playthrough, that is. Clearly, there's no shortage of gameplay content in Bayonetta 3, even if some feel a bit unnecessary. The bewitchments come off as busy work more than actual tasks with rewards. Same goes with the clock puzzles that are just an extra few steps to collectibles that would have been in plain sight otherwise. If anything, these can be completed while revisiting chapters instead of during the first playthrough. However, the remnant chapters and hidden verses play to the strength of Bayonetta 3 being the combat, making them the most engaging pieces of side content the game has to offer. And given that all of these are optional, it makes the mundane side activities rather inoffensive in the grand scheme of things. With all this content, Bayonetta 3 feels like an ambitious game, with large levels, set pieces, and enemies to boot. Consequentially, this impacts the performance on Nintendo Switch, which feels inconsistent. While combat targets 60 FPS, it doesn't always hit that mark. And the on-rails sections like sliding through the city as Gamora are actually capped at 30 frames per second, which, to be fair, does make it feel more stable, but can be jarring compared to the combat. As disappointed as I am that it doesn't hit that 60 FPS target all the time, it wasn't so detrimental that it affected the gameplay. I can only recall one instance where it dipped below 30 during an intense battle, but most of the time it stayed above a 40 FPS, from what my naked eye could tell at least. Visually, 3 looks about on par with the first 2 games, although it's not as bright and colorful as Bayonetta 2, lacking some of its gorgeous areas. Although Bayonetta 3 does have some impressive sequences, it isn't quite the technical showpiece I was hoping for, as it falls short of more recent Switch titles. Even Platinum's Astral Chain had a more striking art style, while Bayonetta 3's is a little dull. Still, the action set pieces can pack a mean punch, so it's almost a miracle a game like this runs above 30 FPS on Switch. When it comes to the soundtrack, it's just as good as the first 2 games, with a new battle theme for Bayonetta, Moonlight Serenade, that flows well with combat, and epic orchestral pieces that play during major boss battles. The standout track, however, is Viola's battle theme Ghost, which might just be the greatest theme in the entire series. At least in my opinion, as it has the vibes of a late 2000s Paramore with a dash of Avril Lavigne that I love so much. These songs, as well as the rest of the soundtrack, can be listened to in the gallery dubbed The World of Bayonetta, where you can also view character models, concept art, and special movies like the intro to John's side chapters. I was surprised by how extensive this gallery was, and I was especially pleased that I could listen to Ghost as many times as I wanted.
Don't worry, I know this song by heart.
Finally, we have to talk about the story, because it feels like it's missing something. The pacing moves at such a breakneck speed that characters like Luca and Jean barely get any time in the spotlight, despite one of them playing a major role. Even Bayonetta doesn't have much depth here, as she merely rolls with the punches of whatever situation the plot throws at her. Now, to be fair, this isn't all that different from the first two games, but there it felt like the events she went through changed her as a person. And though the ending of 3 was quite significant, the journey leading up to it was anything but. That said, if you are a fan of the huge set pieces and wild epic moments, Bayonetta 3 still has that in spades. I only wish the character-driven moments had more thought put behind them. The same can be said for the new villains, Homunculi. These man-made world destroyers had so much potential to be the most threatening beings in the entire series. These weren't angels or demons, rather creations made by man that are literally destroying universes. That's terrifying. But the story isn't interested in exploring why they were created or by whom, which makes the homunculi feel two-dimensional as a result. It still says why they were created and by who, but not much more than that. Bayonetta 3 also introduces the multiverse, and it feels a little underbaked. The different versions of Bayonetta you meet throughout the multiverse are essentially the same, just with different outfits, and they don't feel like characters themselves, only plot devices. It's not until the final act of the game where the multiverse premise is put to somewhat interesting use. And as you might have heard, every version of Bayonetta is no longer voiced by Helena Taylor, instead being replaced by Jennifer Hale. Although the original voice actor is missed, Hale does a great job capturing the tone and inflections that helped make Bayonetta the icon she is. Given that Hale has been voice acting in games longer than I've been alive, it can be distracting hearing her more easily recognized voice come out of Bayonetta's mouth, but she's still a good and wickedly talented replacement.
Could that be a chaos gear? Greedy little thing. Perhaps it's time for a crash diet.
Finally, there's Viola, who is fun to play as, but not as much to listen to. Her dialogue is awkward, and her voice sounds as if she's uncomfortable at times.
I'm hot, soaked, and tired of this shit!
Part of the story is uncovering who she is, and it has the most predictable outcome. I'm just not overly fond of Viola as a character, and this is made even worse by the game seemingly forcing you to like her, by giving her a huge part in the story and teasing her heavy involvement in future titles. Thankfully, she's fun to play as, and that goes for Bayonetta 2. So, in spite of all Bayonetta 3's weaknesses, its strengths are ultimately stronger. The core gameplay is still intact in this third entry, made all the better by new, powerful weapons that literally change the shape of combat. Demon Slave is a welcome addition too, even if I thought some restraint was necessary in order to keep the spotlight on Bayonetta. What holds 3 back from being the best in the trilogy is its weak story that doesn't take full advantage of the multiverse concept and not giving the characters we love enough screen time. That and Viola could have been written better. Some of the content and experimental side chapters with Jean bloats the game more than they should, but even if Bayonetta 3 isn't the best in the series, it still has the high-octane combat the series is known for. The game's framerate could have been better too, but given the limited hardware of the Switch, it's understandable why it runs this way, and it still performs well enough. So with that, I liked Bayonetta 3 a lot. While it may not be my favorite in the series, that honor goes to Bayonetta 2, I was hardly disappointed with the overall package, and I imagine many Bayonetta fans will be pleased with it after an 8-year wait. I also see myself coming back to this game time and time again, appreciating everything it does right while ignoring its flaws. So thanks for watching our review of Bayonetta 3 here on GameXplain. Be sure to subscribe for more reviews like this one, and check out the videos on the right for more topics you might be interested in. Until next time, bye.